Hello, welcome to Module 3. So after today's presentation, you'll be able to identify the three popular theorists whose work contributed to second language acquisition research. You'll be able to understand the correlations between the behaviorist theory and the direct method, audiolingual method, and total physical response. You'll be able to describe how the WUGS test supports the Annatus theory and differentiate between an approach and a method. You'll understand the naturalist approach and Krashen's five theories, and you'll also be able to describe the goal of the communicative language teaching approach. Let's get started. So, in the field of second language acquisition, there are three names you need to know. Those names are Skinner, Chomsky, and Krashen. These theories have a profound amount of work to answer questions related to how people learn. And their work has influenced different language teaching methods and approaches. So we'll start with the grammar translation method. This is one of the first methods of language teaching. And so it's considered old school, it's outdated. It emphasized grammar instructions. Students study grammar rules, they memorize words, and they translated sentences from their target language to their native language. This activity was called a dictogloss. So they would be read a passage in the target language and then they would translate it to their native language. This was ineffective. Students never reach ultimate attainment or native like fluency. Okay, so the behaviorist theory um, came out of the 1950s, of course, by Skinner. And he believed that language is like any other learning and that children are clean slates. They are not born with any innate abilities. That children, people learn language through experience. Language is reinforced in positive or negative ways. When language is enforced, when people are enforced positively, it increases their behavior. When they have a negative reinforcement, it reduces or resolves the behavior. Second language is learned through imitation and memorization, and language learning is focused on output, what the students can produce. Okay, so three methods are aligned with the behaviorist theory, and that is the direct method, audiolingual method, and total physical response. Okay, so we'll start with the direct method. And this was developed by Maximilian Berlitz, and he was a linguist. He developed this in the late 19th century, and it was in response to people wanting to travel. They wanted to learn language so that they could travel. And it was focused on oral communication instead of writing. So they just wanted to be able to speak. Language, some of the focuses of the method is that language will be used naturally. So this isn't focused on content areas or academic areas. That there was no use of the native language. There was, I'm sorry, excuse me, no translation, and everything is contextualized. They were taught in specific contexts and situations, and there was use of realia. These are real objects that they're using, visual aids, imitations, and practice. So, the goal of the method is oral communication and native like pronunciation. They're focused on listening and speaking, and it promoted survival language, just enough to get by. That's like when people learn phrases to travel. They learn just enough to get by. And grammar is learned implicitly, it's not taught explicitly. The role of the teacher and the role of the student, they are co collaborators. So they are working together. It's not teacher led, it's not student led. Some of the activities include demonstrations, question and answers, conversation practice, and again, the dictogloss. So students are read a passage in the target language and they dictate it into their first language, their native language. So here is a sample lesson, and it starts with a warm up. So that's where the teacher introduces new vocabulary, the vocabulary they'll be using during the lesson. So for this lesson, the task is going to a restaurant and ordering. So they would learn the vocabulary word menu, courses, appetizer, entree. And then the teacher would introduce new materials to them, realia. They would get to see and touch a real menu, paper napkins, cloth napkins. There would possibly be a table setting, a tray that the waiter or waitress would carry food on. And then the teacher would model. So the teacher would model how ordering actually sounds. So the teacher might say something like, may I have blank? Or can I please have blank? After the modeling, the students would practice. So they would practice with a lot of support. That support could be a script, that support could be sentence stems, and then they would move from guided practice to independent practice. The students would practice with less support. So maybe not using a script this time and maybe not being provided sentence stems. At the end of the lesson, the teacher would assess if the students met the objective, if they are able to order food at a restaurant, and the teacher would provide some type of feedback. So the strength of the direct method is that they learn useful language. Culture could be taught in specific situations, and the teachers and the students enjoy the direct method. It's fun, it's applicable, and it was effective in those specific situations. The weaknesses, it doesn't really include the students' first language and using the first language to learn a second language. There's no grammar teaching, and so this method couldn't be used in a K-12 setting because students need to learn also in content areas. And there is no academic language, academic vocabulary being taught. And it would work well for only a language class period. This wouldn't work well for a, excuse me, a regular ed classroom or a content area class like math or science or social studies. The next method is the audiolingual method. It's also known as the Army method. And it's called the Army method because it started around World War II when the US was preparing soldiers to become German spies. And this is aligned to the behaviorist theory because of the positive and negative feedback and the automaticity. So there is practice and they're given feedback and practice and feedback until they form a habit. The beliefs about language learning is that it's more effective to have oral language skills first and then move on to written language skills. And grammar is also learned indirectly, similar to the direct method. So the principles, one of the major principles of the audiolingual method is drills, call and response, having native-like pronunciation. If you are going to be a spy, you want to sound like a German speaker. And it's very teacher-centered. Okay, so again, the goal is to be as native-like as possible in your pronunciation and to be automatic, automaticity. It's a habit. You're not thinking about it, you're doing it subconsciously. Okay, so there are four stages. The first one is a stimulus that is provided by the teacher, a response provided by the student, reinforcement, negative or positive, some type of feedback, and then drill, repeat over and over and over again. So the example would start with the teacher saying, there is a pen in my bag. The student would follow up, there is a pen in my bag. Then the teacher would say, pencil. there is a pencil in my bag. The teacher would say, book. The student would say, there's a book in my bag. Then the teacher would say, on the desk, and the students would say, there is a book on the desk. So this is going through a stimulus, a response, a stimulus, a response. If the student was to make an error, there would be some type of reinforcement. That would be negative reinforcement. The fact that they're moving through the task is positive reinforcement. And then they just practice over and over and over again until it's automatic. So this is a video of an instructor, and he is modeling the direct method for teachers that are going to then go and teach others. Make sure that you start the video at 3 minutes, and it is linked on Blackboard. Okay, so some of the strengths of this method would be that it works well for a receptive audience. So in the military, it was their job to learn this. And so it worked well for them because it was their job. This wouldn't be appropriate for school age children and in a school age classroom setting. And another strength is that it works well with large groups. As you'll see in the video, he was able to train a large group of teachers at one time. Weaknesses is very teacher and drill focused. Culture is not addressed, and there is no reliance on the native language to promote learning of the second language. Excuse me, I'm gonna take a drink. So the next method we're going to learn about is the total physical response method, and it is based on the coordination of speech and action. Okay, and its aim is to be automatic, and there's a stimulus and there's a response, similar to the audiolingual method. And it acknowledges that there's a common process for learning your first language, your native language, and learning a second language. Okay, so the goal of the method is to teach language through physical movement from input that they receive. Okay, and they are reinforced positively or negatively. And it starts with teaching listening comprehension, and then it builds on it for oral proficiency. So the teacher's role is to provide the input, the stimulus, and the teacher controls all aspects of the learning, and the students receive the input and then they respond. So the teacher would say, sit down. The students would comprehend that and then they would sit down. And then they would practice this over and over again. The teacher might say, stand up, and then the students would stand up. If the students did it incorrectly, they would receive some type of negative reinforcement. Okay, so this is a video of a teacher who is doing a TPR exercise with young children. Some of the strengths of this method is that it works really well with beginning learners and they love to participate. It's fun, and so they're really motivated. And because they're so motivated, it removes affective filters. So they are willing to take risk and it reduces their stress and anxiety. They want to participate in this activity. Some of the weaknesses are that it doesn't work with older learners. They think that it's childish, they don't want to participate. And this is a method that has to be combined with other methods. There's no way to teach abstract concepts through gestures. Okay, so we've learned about the behaviorist theory and Skinner. We're going to move on to Chomsky in the 1960s with the innatist theory. Okay, so in the innatist theory, Chomsky believed that children are born with innate abilities to learn language. And this led to the discovery of universal language or universal grammar, and that is the innate ability to access grammar rules and principles. These are things that are already in babies' brains when they are born. They already have access to these grammar rules. So there is a link here for the case of the WUGS. It's called the WUGS test. And you're going to watch that, and that will help you better understand the Annatus theory, and how the skills that these children displayed, even though they weren't taught this specific vocabulary, they still had access to it. This video is also linked on Blackboard. Okay, so before we go any further, I want to discuss the difference between a approach and a method. Okay, so an approach is kind of like a direction or angle something is coming from. It's a lens that something is being seen through. A method, on the other hand, is a step-by-step process. Okay? So we're going to talk about the naturalist approach, and this was by Krashen in the 1980s, and um, it was based on these 5 underlying hypotheses, and we're going to go through the hypotheses together. So the first one is acquisition versus learning. And learning is considered not to be as meaningful as acquisition. When somebody acquires language, they are immersed in the language. They're focused on communicating, getting their needs met. When somebody is learning, they're focused on having perfect grammar. And so, learning has its benefits. However, it's not as effective and as meaningful as acquiring a language. The next hypothesis is the monitor hypothesis. And the monitor hypothesis states that we self correct based on the new things that we're learning. Okay, so we have all these things we already learned, and as we learn new things, we begin to self correct errors that we're making, things that are not correct. When it doesn't match, we correct it, we fix it based on our new learning. The next hypothesis is the natural order hypothesis. And Krashen states that there's a natural order in learning language. It starts with understanding, comprehending, and then speaking and reading and writing. Next is the input hypothesis. And input is what learners are taking in. So that is typically what they hear and what they read. Output is what learners are producing. That is their speaking and their writing. Okay, so language learners should receive input that is one level beyond their current level. Okay, so if they only received input at their same level, there would be no growth. Learners need to receive input that's one level higher, and then they grow to that level, and then another level higher. Okay, and then the last one is affective filter hypothesis. And that considers that there are emotional and environmental filters that play a part. They are kind of like a sifter or a screen when it comes to input and language learning. Okay, so we are going to take a look at the communicative language teaching approach. It's one of the most recent approaches, and it kind of emerged in the 80s. It's considered an approach because it's not a process. It is more of a lens, how they consider language learning, the angle of that the language learning is coming from. The goal of CLT is communicative competence. That is being able to use language to get your needs met, not necessarily using it correctly, but to be understood. Okay, so an example of that would be not focused on ordering a pizza grammatically correct, but instead, were you able to order it, and did you receive the pizza? Was your language successful? Okay, so some of the characteristics of CLT is that meaning is primary, being understood is primary, and context is essential. that it is acceptable to use the native language to promote learning of the target language. It's student centered, and it usually has enjoyable activities. And so that decreases the affective filter. Students have more motivation, less stress, less anxiety. Okay, so there are four dimensions or components of CLT. The first one that I'm going to start with is the social linguistic competence, and that's the ability to use language in a socially appropriate way, being able to access idioms and nuances um, in a way that other speakers can understand. The second one is discourse competence, and that is the ability to speak competently to be understood. And um, also to understand the language that you're receiving. So to be able to have input and output that's understandable. The next one is strategic competence, and that's the ability to monitor or to oversee your communication. You can initiate conversation, you can end conversation, you can maintain a conversation back and forth, and you can repair. So if somebody's not understanding your language, what you're saying, you're able to repair, and so they are able to understand. And then the last one is grammatical competence. That's being able to use grammar so that your output is understood. Okay, so some of the characteristics are there's no stress on grammar unless it needs to be addressed. If you are not able to be understood, if you are not able to get your needs met, there may be some grammar issue that needs to be addressed. Also, it is contextualized as many of the other methods and approaches. And so there's a use of realia, real props, real objects that help promote comprehension. And they learn a lot of real world oriented tasks. There's also role play, which students enjoy. And then there's a lot of problem solving in this approach. When you are trying to negotiate meaning, you have to make sure that you're understood. And if you're not, you monitor that. You can tell when somebody is not understanding what you're saying. And so you monitor it and you have to figure out how to fix it. So this is a video of young students. They're doing a language task with their teacher. He has out pictures of food items, and the students are working on articles. So they are requesting food by saying, I want a pear. I want an apple. I want rice. And the teacher is not explicitly teaching them about articles. However, they are learning it indirectly. So this video is also linked on your Blackboard page. So some of the strengths of CLT is that it's student-centered. The teacher is the facilitator. They're guiding the learning, but it's student-centered. In this approach, you hear students talking, not students listening to the teacher. So it is mainly students producing output. It's authentic. And the activities are high interest activities. So the students are motivated to participate, which again brings down their affective filter. Some of the weaknesses is that there's no explicit grammar teaching, and that it is communicatively based, and so it lacks an academic component. So language learning happens all day. However, in public schools, there may be a specific time that students are pulled out to have some type of language class or language instruction. There may be a time when a specialist pushes in to do language support, because students just can't learn language all day. They also have to be exposed to content area teaching. And so there has to be um, a balance between the two. And so None of these methods or approaches can be used by themselves. They have to be used in sync with some type of curriculum. And the content area teaching fully depends on the language teaching that the student has received. If the students can't access the language that the content area is putting before them, then they won't be successful. We know that our students have to come to school and they have to learn content areas. So they have to learn math, they have to learn English language arts, they have to learn science and social studies. They use language to learn those content areas. And then our students are assessed in content areas. And so they take stated test assessments, and then they eventually graduate high school, go on to college. So it's important to know that there's no perfect language teaching method or approach. Most language programs use the best part of each method, the best part of each approach. And that's something that CLT encompasses. They encompass a lot of each approach and each method. That's all I have for you today. Have a great weekend.